Hello dear friends, today I have selected 10 particularly difficult questions for us that you simply cannot answer without studying, with small details that are often overlooked in the exam. We will make the video one take again, as short as possible, so that you get a good boost for your theory test. So, let's start straight away with the first question. The question is, how do we behave here? I am allowed to turn freely. I have to stop in the middle of the intersection. I have to let oncoming traffic pass. Attention, this question carries 4 penalty points. Many of you would now of course tick that you have to stop in the middle of the intersection and let oncoming traffic pass. But we can see the green turn signal arrow up here, which is lit up. That means that oncoming traffic has a red light, and in that case we are of course allowed to turn freely without stopping. So we are only ticking the ones here. So, what else have we selected? Oh, that looks complicated. What is the rule of thumb for calculating the braking distance of an emergency stop on a level, dry, and asphalted road?
So, this is the formula for the braking distance. It's the speed get 10 times the speed get 10. I know that many of you will no longer know which way is up front and which way is down back when faced with formulas. There are so many numbers, then you see something like this. I'm telling you, you don't need all of that. You only need 2 formulas. And this is one for the reaction distance and one for the braking distance. In this case, it's the formula above. And now, pay attention, this is asking about the braking distance in an emergency stop. That means a child runs into the street, you slam on the brakes. That's different than braking for a yellow light or when a child runs into the street. And emergency braking is always dangerous. There you go. And then you take this formula and simply divide the result by 2. That's the stopping distance. Sorry, this is the braking distance in an emergency stop. So, we're going to choose the first possible answer. If you have serious problems with the formula, write it in the comments below. If the comment gets enough thumbs up, I'll make a separate video about it. So, I've also picked out this question for us here.
You want to turn left. Which lane do you have to follow? Be careful, there's a high risk of confusion. Let's look at the picture. We can see that we have a one-way street up there. As you know, you always have to position yourself as far to the left as possible when turning left. There shouldn't be any oncoming vehicles on a one-way street. That means that the farthest left is the very, very, very left, so we're going to choose the left lane here. Be careful, remember this. Let's see if I can get the matching opposite image right away. Perfect. You want to turn left. Which lane do you have to follow? So here too, always position yourself as far to the left as possible. This time, however, we see an additional sign below the one-way street sign, which means that in this case, cyclists can also come towards us. So, we have to move as far to the left as possible, and in this case, far enough to allow cyclists to come towards us. So this time, we don't cross the far left lane, but the one in the middle. So not left, not right, but in this case in the middle. You want to turn right at the intersection. Which is correct? I'm only allowed to cross the cycle lane at walking pace. I change lanes as early as possible. I'm not allowed to obstruct cyclists on the cycle lane. So, be careful, the walking pace thing sounds too good to be true. We won't check that box. Imagine if you were to slow down from 50 or, in this case, 30 km per hour to 7 km per hour. Up here in the rearview mirror, we can even see the cyclist. Even he is driving faster than walking pace. That wouldn't be good, and it's not right either. Are you even allowed to drive in this lane? Yes, you are allowed to cross over. You are not allowed to ride on the lane, but to turn we have to cross over to the right, and we are allowed to use it for a short time. The only thing is that we are not allowed to obstruct the cyclist. That means the cyclist is not allowed to stop pedaling because of us. Then we would be an obstruction, and that would even result in us failing the test, and that immediately. So, we will only cross over at walking pace, under no circumstances. We will change lanes as early as possible. That sounds good, not waiting until the end, like with the merge lane, but crossing over immediately when there is time and space. We are not allowed to obstruct the cyclist, that is also correct. As I said, he must not only not be endangered because of us, but also not obstructed. That makes a difference. So, then I have marked another important point here. Oh yes, what applies after this traffic sign?
So, it is about the place name sign up here. It could say anything: Munich, Berlin, Hamburg, Bremen.
I am free to choose the lane for my direction. That's a bit strangely worded. I'm allowed to drive faster in the right lane than vehicles in the left lane. I'm allowed to drive faster than 50 kilometers per hour because of the multi-lane road. So what does that even mean? Let's start with the last answer option because it's the easiest. The speed limit is 50 kilometers per hour from this place name sign. That's why the last answer option is already wrong. We're allowed to drive 100 kilometers per hour in that direction, but a maximum of 50 after the place name sign. So don't tick the last answer option. What was the second one again? We're allowed to drive faster in the right lane than in the left. Attention, there's a question about driving on the right and whether you're allowed to overtake on the right. You've probably heard this rule before, and maybe your driving instructor has even intervened while you were driving on the motorway. You're only allowed to use the right lane outside built-up areas. Unless you want to overtake or are allowed to overtake and are driving faster than the person you want to overtake. And then it may be that your driving instructor has already intervened because you have been driving in the middle lane on the motorway, even though everything is clear to your right. Because outside of built-up areas, the so-called right-hand lane rule applies and vehicles are only allowed to overtake on the left and not on the right. In built-up areas, according to this traffic sign, you have free lane choice. So you are allowed to drive in every lane at all times. You don't always have to move over to the right, and you are also allowed to overtake on the right. That's why the 1 and the 2 are correct. Now you're probably wondering why it's like this in built-up areas and like this outside built-up areas. Of course, we're in Germany, where there is no speed limit on the motorway, and it's definitely better if slow vehicles drive in the right lane and those overtaking always use the left lane. And in built-up areas, everyone drives at the same speed, or mostly the same speed. Also, there are no major differences in speed, which is why you are allowed to use every lane and overtake on the right. What should you check before setting off? I check whether I have the registration certificate Part 2 with me. I check whether every passenger is wearing a seatbelt. I check whether I can ensure sufficient traffic observation. So, that all sounds great. Is everything correct? Of course not. So, of course we make sure that we have a clear view to the rear, that the mirrors fit, that we can see through the rear view mirror, and that we don't have a huge cupboard or something like that in the trunk. That makes sense. Of course we also make sure that all passengers are wearing seatbelts. That is our responsibility. But you probably don't have the registration certificate Part 2 because you may have listed your vehicle. In that case, the certificate of approval Part 2 is perhaps at the bank or perhaps at the car dealer. What you need to have with you is the registration certificate Part 1. This is the small booklet that is folded twice or 3 times, and you always have to have it with you. If the police don't come out when you are involved in an accident, then you need the certificate of registration Part 1. And if the vehicle belongs to you, then you most likely have the second part hidden in a safe, in a bank safe deposit box or somewhere. That's why we don't check number 1, but we do check number 2 and number 3, and we still have 3. How far away do you have to stay from the St. Andrew's Cross when parking outside of town?
St. Andrew's Cross is the one that shows you that a no is actually not correct. Yes, the St. Andrew's Cross says that rail traffic has priority, but of course, if rail traffic has priority, then there will also be a level crossing there. So, the level crossing is coming up and it makes a difference whether you want to park in front of it in town or outside of town. In built-up areas, you have to keep a distance of 5 meters, and outside built-up areas, it's 50 meters. So you get 2 answers in one. Outside built-up areas, you're only allowed to park after 50 meters. You're
driving 100 kilometers per hour and are braking normally. How long is the braking distance according to the rule of thumb? So, if you paid close attention at the beginning, you'll be able to answer that yourself. What was that formula again? It was at the very top. It was the speed being driven divided by 10 times the speed being driven divided by 10. So, 100 kilometers per hour by 10 is 10 and 10 times 10 is 100. That means that our braking distance at 100 kilometers per hour is also 100 meters. Although that's not entirely correct, the formula we had at the beginning was the braking distance in an emergency braking situation. Here, we're asking about normal braking. So there's a high risk of confusion here too. For emergency braking, you would then have to divide 100 by 2 again. What is the maximum speed a motor vehicle is allowed to drive with snow chains? That is also a question of numbers. You simply need them for the theory test. You can actually remember that quite easily with the 50 kilometers per hour that you are also allowed to drive in built-up areas. That is also 50 kilometers per hour with snow chains. So, I hope you enjoyed the 10 questions. If so, please give the video a thumbs up. Learn the questions that will be asked in the theory test, nothing else. Check out the video below, where the questions that will be asked in the theory test are explained in detail. Up here is the playlist with the remaining videos, and I hope you have subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss any further videos. You can definitely test and demonstrate your knowledge there. I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, ciao.